Welcome to part 2 of today's lecture. We've seen already that there are 3 features of incentives which suggest they might be strongly favoured. These are that they are non-coercive, can be comparatively less costly, and seemingly can be effective. Now we're going to consider 4 potential objections to their use. In the strongest form of these objections, they would deny the permissibility, the justifiability of using incentives altogether. Let's start with perhaps the most vehement objection to economic incentives and political incentives. This is what we can call the rewarding evil objection. The worry is this: incentives wrongly reward those who are engaged in mass atrocities, who've killed or been complicit in the killing of thousands of innocent civilians, for instance, or those engaged in serious aggression. This worry, for instance, is found within certain factions of the political community in the US. They view positive incentives not only as counterproductive, but as morally wrong. Indeed, incentives can often be difficult to secure because of this perception. For example, the US Congress blocked Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon's attempts in the early 1970s to offer the Soviet Union political and economic incentives in return for restrained behavior. This could have made a significant dent into the Cold War, into the warmth, into the hotness of the Cold War. More recently, the peace deal between the FARC rebels in Colombia and the Colombian state was blocked by the electorate, who narrowly voted to reject the deal. Although the deal would have ended the civil war, where 200,000 people died, it was viewed as giving the FARC rebels too much of a good deal, as rewarding them too much for their previous behavior.
Has been considered the most important vote in Colombia for decades. But less than 40% of those registered to take part actually went to the polling stations. Of those who did, the majority decided to say no. No to the peace deal that less than a week ago was signed by President Juan Manuel Santos and the leader of the FARC, Rodrigo Londoño, to put an end to 52 years of a bloody war that has left more than 220,000 people dead and millions displaced. It was a Brexit moment for many in Colombia. The yes vote was beaten by a small margin, but now in Colombia, many are saying and thinking how they can carry the agreement forward regardless of the plebiscite vote.
As President, I uphold entirely my ability and my responsibility to maintain public order and to continue to seek and to negotiate for peace. The existing bilateral ceasefire and end of hostilities is in effect and will continue to be in effect.
He wants to meet with those who supported the no to find a way forward. What that way will be is not yet clear. Natalio Gosoy, BBC News, in Bogotá, Colombia.
So the rewarding evil objection concerns a moral worry about the wrongness of rewarding wrongdoers. We've got a picture here on the slide of Assad on the trip to Paris, and there's a picture of a very fancy shopping centre in Paris. So a moral worry about rewarding wrongdoers, such as potentially Assad, and the example I gave earlier of offering him a reward to step down, as well as a political worry about the feasibility of using this because it will receive opposition politically. Now, one query here. The political worry can probably be more easily repudiated. Inducements could be offered covertly, so you could offer the positive incentives covertly without it being publicly known. Or they might be able to be defended by skillful politicians against the public who might not explained to the public very carefully the case for using positive incentives. The worry also applies to particular states where there's a stronger sense of vengefulness, arguably in the UK and US, rather than other states that might be more pragmatic about these things. But the moral worry is less easily dismissed. And it can be fleshed out more precisely. And this is in terms of the worry, and this is in terms of the moral importance of desert. The point is this: those who do not deserve to be benefited with incentives receive a significant reward for their wrongful behavior. In fact, they don't simply deserve not to be benefited, they deserve to be, the argument goes, punished. The rewarding evil objection also says further that incentives are problematic because they are unfair. This is because those who do not commit abuses can claim that they have been treated unfairly. They conform to moral requirements. They do what they should be doing, but they don't receive any financial reward. To explain this, consider the case I've come up with of Sierra Leone and Liberia. These two extremely poor states face significant internal uprisings, suppose. And suppose that the Liberian government speaks to the leaders of the uprising, negotiates with them, tries to address their grievances when they're legitimate. The government of Sierra Leone, by contrast, engages in a purge of the rebel leaders and significantly exacerbates the situation. And as a result, there's a very bloody and brutal civil war. The government of Sierra Leone only agrees to a negotiated end to this civil war when there's significant financial investment offered by another state, say India. The officials in Sierra Leone filter a lot of this money for themselves, go on expensive shopping trips to Paris, if you like, buy expensive luxury goods. The Liberian government is now in a weaker position. It lacks this investment, despite the fact that it did what it ought to have done. It can rightly claim that if there is to be investment, if there is to be some sort of reward, it is the one that deserves the investment. It's the one that deserves the reward, not Sierra Leone. So it's unfair in this comparative sense of unfairness. So there are two different sorts of wrong here. The first is that it's simply not what people deserve. They don't deserve to be benefited. And the secondly is it's unfair on those who don't deserve, who is unfair on those who don't get the benefit. Now, how much does this matter? How much do you think it matters, these two concerns? Have a think for a second. Suppose that in the case that we've just looked at, the use in positive investment by India would significantly reduce the overall amount of harm to the innocent civilians in Sierra Leone, despite the fact it also funded a few shopping trips. And the civilians are subject to far fewer intentional and unintentional attacks by government forces and rebel groups and other forms of unintentional harm. The positive investment, the fact that it's used by some officials for shopping trips, is that sufficient to outweigh the potential benefit that you get, that the citizens from Sierra Leone would get from the investment? And is it wrong? Is it sufficiently weighty enough to outweigh the potential unfairness to those in Liberia? So you might think that giving a few people things that they don't deserve can be outweighed by the importance of addressing effectively situations of mass atrocities and serious external aggression. This depends somewhat on how much one thinks the intrinsic wrongness of giving someone a benefit, which is a deontological consideration. Remember, that means wrong in itself, regardless of the consequences. How much you think that is really a significant consideration versus effectively addressing the situation. Let's now consider a second potential objection. This is called the crowding out objection. In the literature on the use of incentives in general, such as in healthcare, one notable worry is this notion of crowding out. What does this mean? Well, it means that incentives provide extrinsic motivation for compliance. Extrinsic means coming from outside. And this crowds out any intrinsic motivation. So it provides a motivation for people to do what they should be doing, not from themselves, from their own rationale, from their own thinking through, how should I respond to this situation, but by an outside source. And this crowds out the good sorts of reasons, the inside sorts of reasons that you might have for behaving well, or behaving appropriately. The intrinsic motivations, argue, will no longer be present as the agent becomes reliant upon the incentive. So suppose that you're offered a large financial reward to offer a much healthier lifestyle, to adopt a much healthier lifestyle. This would be an extrinsic motivation, and this might come to dominate any intrinsic motivation that you have to be healthy. You might see your health, you might be less motivated by any internal reasons, thinking only about the potential financial offer. Now, this is worrisome. Crowding out is worrisome because without the incentive, individuals or states can go back to their original behavior when there is no longer an offer on the table. So suppose, for instance, that you're given money to adopt a much healthier to eat much more healthily. And while that offer is on the table, you do eat healthily. But then you come to see healthy eating all as about gaining financial reward. When that offer ceases, you don't have any intrinsic motivation, internal motivation to eat healthily. I'll give you a more international case of this, relevant to this module. In 2011, in Afghanistan, the Times alleged that Italy secretly paid Taliban insurgents in the Sarobi district of Afghanistan not to fight. Now, Italy was in control of the area for quite a while, but then France took over. When France took over, it hadn't been aware of the money that was being paid to the Taliban insurgents. Didn't realize that was what was going on, and so seriously underestimated the threat level. They didn't pay the money, they didn't know they had to, and as a result, 10 French soldiers were brutally killed by insurgents who were no longer in receipt of the income. The incentive can also have a longer-term negative effect of removing any lingering intrinsic motivation. I've already alluded to this, but just to make the point really clear, it removes any lingering intrinsic motivation. So, the philosopher Michael Sandel, one of the most famous liberal political philosophers, famously Mr. Burns from The Simpsons was apparently based upon him. You can see from that picture, it does look a bit like Mr. Burns. He argues that paying kids to read books might get them to read more, but also teach them to regard reading as a chore rather than the source of intrinsic satisfaction. The result may be that they soon stop reading once the incentive is removed. But is this really important? Now, you might think that even if incentives do crowd out internal motivation, it's not particularly problematic. How much should we care about the internal motivation of those who are engaged in mass atrocities or serious external aggression? What you might think is actually what's far more important is tackling the situation effectively. And here's another reply. Incentives might, in fact, help sometimes to crowd in motivation. Crowd in motivation. What this means is that they can help to realize an internal motivation that someone has but hasn't quite fulfilled it. Jonathan Wolff, another political philosopher, argues that incentives can act as a rationalization, that is, allow an individual to justify his or her behavior to a peer group that would not otherwise accept the motivation as a justifying reason. He gives the example of a child who secretly likes reading, but whose friends are very scornful of this. If an incentive is available, he can use the financial incentive to rationalize reading to the group, pointing to the fact that he receives $2 a book, for instance. He doesn't think it's cool, but he gets some money for doing so. So according to Wolff, incentives can act as this rationalization. And on this understanding, he argues, cash payments allow individuals to act on non-cash motivations that they have. And so they're not corrupting. On the contrary, they can, he argues, be liberating. The same thought might apply to states. They can use incentives to rationalize to their constituents their behavior. And when they would not otherwise accept their leaders' reasons for doing so. As I've already said, they can help persuade a recalcitrant domestic constituency of the need of the reasons for stepping back on, for instance, aggression, or recalcitrant other parts of the leadership. They can say, look, we've got a huge financial offer here, let's take it and step back. So they can crowd in motivation. That's the second objection. We see in the second objection a couple of responses. Let's now turn to the third objection. This is what we can call the corruption objection. The worry here is that incentives corrupt society. Rather than reducing compliance with moral norms, rather than thinking that there's something that should be expected to do the right thing, compliance becomes something that should be paid for. And in particular, this concerns economic incentives. The economic motive might become predominant in general. So this differs from the previous objection, the crowding out objection, which concerns just the specific issue, where the incentive, the motivation for saying being more healthy or addressing aggression is crowded out, intrinsic motivation. Here, the point is that all good motivation is crowded out, is pushed out. All good motivation is corrupted. In Ruth Grant, in her book called Strings Attached, which is on the reading list, it's on the handout, you'll see, one of the political philosophers who is critical of incentives. This is what she calls the spillover effect. She argues this: if you pay your child to mow the lawn, he or she is less likely to be willing to do the dishes for free. Relying on incentives in one area can affect attitudes and behaviors in another. By introducing payments in the family setting, you introduce the norms of the commercial domain or the market into a realm previously governed by different more cooperative norms of family or community responsibility. In the context of mass atrocities and aggression, states and other actors will not see compliance with morally desirable norms, such as the RTP, as something they should do because they ought not to do it. They will see it as something that they should be paid to do, rewarded to do. So rather than addressing mass atrocities or not committing mass atrocities or not committing aggression as something they just morally required to do, is an appropriate standard of behavior, it's a norm in international society, they will view it as something that they should be paid or rewarded otherwise, given a political inducement to do. And this, it's argued, could erode compliance with norms such as RTP or aggression against aggression when the incentive is not offered. So that's the third objection, the corruption of the norms of international society. The fourth worry is about this, moral hazard. It's that the use of incentives, for instance, to attempt to secure healthy outcomes, will lead to healthy people to engage in unhealthy behaviors in order to become eligible for the incentive. So they might start to eat really unhealthily in order to then get the incentive, get the reward, get the money to stop eating unhealthily. The same might be thought to occur with states, and particularly poorer states. They might think, well, how can I get some money? I can start to engage in human rights abuses, mass atrocities, aggression, and then get a significant positive incentive, economic incentive, significant aid, significant investment, get a significant political inducement, major seat in the international body, for instance, if I do so. So the thought then that there's a moral hazard involved. If you start offering incentives to everyone who behave badly, it will encourage people to engage in bad behavior. Now, one reply to this argument questions whether this is really that important. And the reply is that even if there is some moral hazard effect or some moral corruption concerning the previous objection, this doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of thinking about responses to mass atrocities and responses to aggression overall. What matters is that there are numerous occasions when incentives do play a role in tackling mass atrocities and aggression. So even if you get a few instances where some poorer states do engage in a few additional rights abuses, if incentives generally work, generally stop people from engaging in the bad behavior, this is overall beneficial and should be welcome. That's the reply. Okay. One final point before we end this part of today's lecture. And this concerns the relationship between incentives and coercive measures. If you give economic aid, you can threaten to take it away again. If you offer an investment, you can often threaten to take that investment away. So this is a converse point of what we looked at in the first part of today's lecture, where we saw that sanctions can lead to an incentive. When you offer an incentive, it can also provide a form of a sanction later down the line. It's another way of getting leverage on the potential state, on the recipients. It's another potential stick that you can have to hold the recipient to account. So if you offer an incentive to a state that's engaged in mass atrocities, say, ongoing aid. If they stop their behavior, great, you continue offering the incentive. If they start it up again, you can withdraw it. That then becomes a form of a sanction. More generally, if you offer an incentive to a state, investment into a state, when you threaten to then withdraw it, it's another form of pressure that you can put on the state to comply with the norms that we're concerned with, such as R2P, aggression, so on, and human rights. So this might provide a reason then to engage in economic, political incentives in order to add another thing that states can do in the future to be able to respond to mass atrocities or aggression. It's another way of adding leverage. But interestingly, you might also think that this provides a reason to maintain coercive measures. We might often need to maintain coercive measures, such as sanctions, to be able to offer their potential future lifting. This allows a positive incentive in the future. So without the preceding sticks, states and other agents then don't have the carrot of offering the lifting of the stick. So, for instance, if you don't have the sanctions regime on Iran, not the most recent one, the previous one, you don't have the incentive of offering to lift that sanctions regime on Iran to encourage Iran to improve its behavior. Okay, that brings to an end the second part of today's lecture. In the third part of today's lecture, we're going to focus particularly on the case for legal incentives and amnesties.